All right, we're back. Chapter 10, page 162, Mitigation. Americans' prisons have become warehouses for the mentally ill. Mass incarceration has been largely fueled by misguided drug policy and excessive sentencing. But the internment of hundreds of thousands of poor, mentally ill people has been a driving force in achieving our record levels of imprisonment. It created unprecedented problems. For over a century, Americans suffering from serious mental illness have been shifted between prisons and mental institutions. In the late 19th century, alarmed by inhumane treatment of mentally ill people in prison, Dorothy Dix and Reverend Lewis Dwight had led a successful campaign to get mentally ill people out of prison. As a result, state mental hospitals started opening up to provide care for the mentally distressed. But by the middle of the 20th century, abuses within these mental hospitals began generating a lot of attention. Families, teachers, and courts were sending thousands of people to institutions for issues like resisting social, cultural, or sexual norms, not for acute mental illness. People who were gay, transgender, or engaged in interracial dating found themselves committed against their will. In the 1960s and 1970s, laws were enacted to prevent involuntary commitment. People with developmental disabilities were empowered to refuse treatment. Forced institutionalization became much less common. By the 1990s, several states had reduced the patient count in mental hospitals by more than 95%. With these reforms were desperately needed, the timing of them intersected with the spread of mass imprisonment policy, expanding criminal statutes and harsh sentencing, and the effects were disastrous. The free world became perilous for deinstitutionalized poor people suffering from serious mental disabilities such as schizophrenia or psychosis. Disabled, low-income people who could not afford to receive treatment or necessary medication were greatly at risk of police encounter that would result in jail or prison time. Jail and prison had already become the state's strategy for dealing with the health crisis created by drug use and dependency. Now, on top of that, a flood of mentally ill people headed to prison for minor offenses and drug crimes, or simply for behaviors their communities were unwilling to tolerate. Today, over 50% of prison and jail inmates in the United States have a diagnosed mental illness. In fact, there are more than 3 times the number of seriously mental ill individuals in prison or jail than in hospitals. In some states, that number is 10 times. And prison is a terrible place for someone with mental illness or neurological disorder that prison guards are not trained to understand. For instance, when I still worked in Atlanta, our office sued Louisiana's notoriously rough Angelo prison for refusing to modify a policy that required prisoners in segregation cells to place their hands through bars for handcuffing before officers entered to move them. Disabled prisoners with epilepsy and seizure disorders would sometimes need assistance while convulsing in their cells, and because they couldn't put their hands through the bars, guards would mace them or use fire extinguishers to subdue them. This intervention aggravated the health problems of the prisoners and sometimes resulted in death. Most prisons are overcrowded and don't have the capacity to provide care and treatment to the mentally ill. Without treatment, complying with the many rules of prison life is impossible for many disabled people. Other prisoners exploit or react violently to their behavioral symptoms. Frustrated prison staff frequently subject them to abusive punishment, solitary confinement, or the most extreme forms of detention. Many judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers do a poor job of recognizing the special needs of the mentally disabled, which leads to wrongful convictions, lengthier prison terms, and high rates of returns to prison after release. A lot of clients on death row have had serious mental illnesses. For some, mental illness has developed in prison as a result of stress and trauma. But Avery Jenkins' letters, handwritten in print so small I needed a magnifying glass to read them, convinced me that he had been very ill for a long time. I looked up his case and began to piece together his story. It turned out he'd been convicted of the very disturbing and brutal murder of an older man. The multiple stab wounds inflicted on the victim strongly suggested mental illness, but the court records and files never reference anything about Jenkins suffering from a disability. I thought I'd find out more meeting him in person. When I pulled into the prison parking lot, I noticed a pickup truck that looked like a shrine to the Old South. It was completely covered with disturbing bumper stickers, Confederate flag decals, and other troubling images about guns and Southern identity. One read, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own damn cotton." Despite growing up around images of the Confederate South and working in the Deep South for many years, I was pretty shaken by the symbols. I'd always been especially interested in the Reconstruction era of American history. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved. She was born in Virginia in the 1880s after federal troops had been withdrawn and a reign of terror had begun, designed to deprive African Americans of any political or social rights. Her father told her stories about how the promise of freedom and equality following slavery ended immediately as white Southerners reclaimed their political power through violence. Recently, emancipated black people were essentially re-enslaved by former Confederate officers and soldiers who used intimidation, lynching, and espionage to keep African Americans subordinate and marginalized. Terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan cloaked themselves in the symbols of the Confederate South to intimidate and victimize thousands of black people. For 100 years, any sign of black progress in the South could trigger a white reaction that included Confederate symbols, threats. In the 1950s and 1960s, civil rights activism and new federal laws inspired the same resistance to racial progress and once again led to a spike in the use of Confederate imagery. In fact, it was in the 1950s, after racial segregation in public schools was declared unconstitutional in Brown v. Board of Education, that many southern states erected Confederate flags atop their state government buildings. At a pretrial hearing, I once argued against the exclusion of African Americans from the jury pool. After presenting the data and making my arguments about the unconstitutional exclusion of African Americans, the judge complained loudly. "I'm going to grant your motion, Mr. Stevenson. But I'll be honest, I'm pretty fed up with people always talking about minority rights. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans. When is someone going to come to my courtroom and protect the rights of Confederate Americans?" I wanted to ask if being born in the South or living in Alabama made me a Confederate American, but I thought better of it. I stopped in the prison yard to take a closer look at the truck, walking around it and reading the stickers and symbols of racial oppression. As I entered the prison, I was met by a correctional officer I'd never seen before. He was a white man of my height, about 6 feet tall, with a muscular build. He looked to be in his early 40s and wore a short, military haircut. He was staring coldly at me with steel blue eyes. I walked toward the gate that led to the lobby of the visitation room, where I expected a routine pat-down before meeting Avery Jenkins in the visitation area. The officer stepped in front of me and blocked me from proceeding. "What are you doing?" he snarled. "I'm here for a legal visit," I replied. "It was scheduled earlier this week. The people in the warden's office have the papers." I smiled and spoke as politely as I could to diffuse the situation. That's fine, but you have to be searched first. You're going to go into that bathroom and take everything off if you expect to get into my prison." I was shocked but spoke as nicely as I could. "Oh, no, sir, I think you might be confused. I'm an attorney. Lawyers don't have to get strip searched to come in for legal visits." Instead of calming him, this seemed to make him angrier. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not coming into my prison without complying with our security protocols. Now you can get into that bathroom and strip, or you can go back to wherever you came from." I had some difficult encounters with officers getting into prisons from time to time, mostly in small county jails or places where I'd never been before, but this was highly unusual. I've been to this prison many times and never been required to submit to a strip search. "I don't think this is the procedure," I said more firmly. "Well, I don't know, and I don't care what other people do, but this is the protocol I use," he snapped. I'd given 2 hours for this visit and had a very tough schedule over the next 3 weeks. I wouldn't be able to get back to the prison anytime soon if I didn't get in now. I went inside the bathroom and removed my clothes. The officer came in and gave me an unnecessary aggressive search before mumbling that I was clear. I put my suit back on and walked out. I'd like to get inside the visitation room now. I tried to reclaim some dignity by speaking more forcefully. "Well, you have to go back and sign the book." He said it coolly, but he was clearly trying to provoke me. "I already signed the attorney book. It would make no sense to sign a second book." "Lawyers don't have to sign that book. If you want to come in my prison, you'll sign the book." He seemed to be smirking now. I tried hard to keep my composure, turned it around, and signed my name. I walked back to the visitation room and waited until the officer finally pulled out his keys to unlock the door. When he opened the door, I stepped forward, but he grabbed my arm to stop me. He lowered his voice as he spoke. "Hey man, do you happen to see a truck out in the visitation yard with a lot of bumper stickers, flags, and a gun rack?" His face hardened. "I want you to know that's my truck." Then he released my arm and allowed me to walk inside the prison. I felt angry at the guard, but I was even more irritated by my own powerlessness. I was distracted by my thoughts when the door of the visitation room opened and Mr. Jenkins was led in by another officer. Jenkins was a short African-American man with close cropped hair. He grasped my hand with both of his and smiled broadly as he sat down. He seemed unusually happy to see me. Mr. Jenkins, my name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the attorney you spoke. Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake? He spoke quickly. I'm sorry, what did you say? He kept grinning. Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake? I want a chocolate milkshake. The trip, the Confederate truck, the harassment from the guard, and now the request for a milkshake, this was becoming a bizarre day. I didn't hide my impatience. No, Mr. Jenkins, I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake. I'm an attorney. I'm here to help you with your case and try to get you a new trial, okay? That's why I'm here. Now I need to ask you some questions and try to understand what's going on. I saw the grin fade quickly from the man's face and started asking questions, and he gave single-word answers, sometimes just grunting out a yes or no. I realized that he was still thinking about his milkshake. My frustration with the officer had made me forget how impaired this man might be. I stopped the interview and I leaned forward. Mr. Jenkins, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize you wanted me to bring you a chocolate milkshake. If I had known that, I would absolutely have tried. I promise that the next time I come, if they let me bring you in a chocolate milkshake, I'll definitely do it, okay? With that, his smile returned, and his mood brightened. He was generally kind and gentle in our meeting, but he was clearly ill. His prison records revealed that he had often experienced psychotic episodes in which he would scream for hours. His trial records made no reference to mental illness. When I returned to my office, we began a deeper investigation into Mr. Jenkins' background. What we found was heartbreaking. His father had been murdered before he was born, and his mother had died of a drug overdose when he was a year old. He'd been in foster care since he was 2 years old, and it had been horrific. 19 different foster homes before he turned 8. Many of the families that had taken him in were physically and sexually abusive. He began showing signs of intellectual disability at an early age. He had cognitive impairments that suggested some organic brain damage and behavioral problems that suggested schizophrenia and other serious mental illness. By the time he was 13, he had started abusing drugs and alcohol. By 15, he was having seizures and experiencing psychotic episodes. At 17, he was left homeless. Avery was in and out of jail until he turned 20, when in the midst of a psychotic episode, he wandered into a strange house, thinking he was being attacked by demons. In the house, he brutally stabbed to death a man he believed to be a demon. His lawyers did no investigations in Mr. Jenkins' history prior to trial, and he was quickly convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The prison would not let me bring Mr. Jenkins a milkshake. I tried to explain this to him, but at the very start of every visit, he'd ask me if I brought one. I promised that I would keep trying. I had to, just to get him to focus on anything else. Months later, we were finally scheduled to go to court to present the material that his lawyers should have presented at trial, evidence about his profound mental illness. Before the hearing started, I went to see Avery in the court's basement holding cell. After going through my usual protocol about the milkshake, I tried to get him to understand what would happen in court. I was concerned that seeing some of the witnesses, people who had dealt with him when he was in foster care, might upset him. Also, the testimony the experts would provide would be very direct in characterizing his disabilities and illnesses. I wanted him to understand why we were doing that. He was pleasant and agreeable, as always. Upstairs in the courtroom, I spotted the correctional officer who had given me such a hard time when I first met Avery. I hadn't seen him since that initial ugly encounter. He must have been the officer assigned to transport Avery to the hearing. I'd asked another client about the guard and was told that he had a bad reputation. Most people tried to steer clear of him. Over the next 3 days, we presented our evidence about Avery's background. The medical expert who spoke about Avery's disabilities were terrific. They explained how organic brain damage, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder can create severe mental impairment. They explained that the psychosis and other serious mental health problems that Mr. Jenkins had could lead to dangerous behavior. This dangerous behavior stemmed from serious illness. It was not a reflection of his character. We also put forth evidence of how the foster care system had failed Avery. Several of the foster parents with whom Avery had been placed were later convicted of sexual abuse and criminal mismanagement of foster children. We discussed how Avery had been passed from one dangerous situation to the next until he was drug addicted and homeless. Several of Avery's former foster parents admitted to being very frustrated by him because they didn't know how to deal with his severe mental health problems. I argued to the judge that not taking Avery's mental health issues into consideration at trial was as cruel as saying to someone who had lost his legs, "You must climb these stairs with no assistance, and if you don't, you're just lazy." There are hundreds of ways we accommodate physical disabilities, or at least understand them. But because mental disabilities aren't visible in the same way, we tend to be dismissive of them and quick to judge. Brutally murdering someone would, of course, require the state to hold that person accountable and to protect the public. But to completely disregard a person's disability would be unfair in deciding what degree of culpability to assign and what sentence to impose. I went back home feeling very good about the hearing, but I wasn't expecting any miracle rulings. About a month after the hearing, before judgment was rendered, I decided to go to the prison to see if Avery was okay. When I pulled into the parking lot, I once again saw that loathsome truck with its flags, stickers, and gun rack. Sure enough, as I headed toward the visitation room, I saw the guard approaching me. I braced myself, preparing for the encounter, and then something surprising happened. "Hello, Mr. Stevenson. How are you?" the guard asked. He sounded earnest and sincere, and he wasn't glaring at me for once. I was skeptical, but I decided to play along. "Well, I'm fine. Look, I'll step into the bathroom to get ready for your search." "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, you don't have to worry about that," he quickly replied. "I know you're okay." Everything about his tone and demeanor was different. "Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'll go back and sign the book then." "Mr. Stevenson, you don't have to do that. I saw you coming and signed your name in for you. I've taken care of it." I realized that he actually looked nervous. Confused, I thanked him and walked to the visitation room door with the officer following behind me. He turned to unlock the padlock so that I could go inside. Before I could enter, he placed his hand on my shoulder. "Hey, I'd like to tell you something." I wasn't sure where he was going with this. "You know, I took old Avery to court for his hearing and was down there with you all for those 3 days, and I want you to know that I was listening." He removed his hand from my shoulder and looked past me as if staring at something behind me. "You know, I appreciate what you're doing. I really do. It was kind of difficult for me to be in that courtroom to hear what you all was talking about. I came up in foster care too." His face softened. "Man, I didn't think anybody had it as bad as me. They moved me around like I wasn't wanted nowhere. I had it pretty rough. But listening to what you was saying about Avery made me realize that there were other people who had it as bad as I did. I guess even worse. I mean, it brought back a lot of memories sitting in that courtroom." He reached into his pocket to pull out a handkerchief to wipe perspiration from his brow. I noticed for the first time that he had a Confederate flag tattooed on his arm. "You know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it's good for what you're doing. I got so angry coming up that there were plenty of times when I really wanted to hurt somebody just because I was angry. I made it to 18, joined the military, and you know, I've been okay. But sitting in that courtroom brought back memories, and I think I realized how I'm still kind of angry." I smiled. He continued. "That expert doctor you put up with that said that some of the damage that's done to kids in these abusive homes is permanent. That some kind of me made me worry. You think that's true?" "Oh, I think we can always do better," I told him. "The bad things that happen to us don't define us. It's just important sometimes that people understand where we're coming from." Another officer walked by and stared at us. I went on. "You know, I really appreciate you saying to me what you just said. It means a lot. I really mean that. Sometimes I forget how well we all need mitigation at some point." He looked at me and smiled. "You kept talking about mitigation in that court. When I got home, I looked it up. I wasn't sure what you meant at first, but now I do. I think you done good, real good." He looked me in the eye before he extended his hand. We shook hands, and I started toward the door. I was just about inside when he grabbed my arm again. "Oh, wait, I've got to tell you something else. Listen, I did something I probably wasn't supposed to do. On the trip back down here after court, well, I took him to Wendy's, and I brought him a chocolate milkshake." That's nice. I stared at him incredulously, and he broke into a chuckle. Then he left me inside the room. I was so stunned by what the officer said, I didn't hear the other officer bring Avery into the room. When I realized Avery was there, I turned and greeted him. When he didn't say anything, I was a little alarmed. "Are you okay?" "Yes, sir, I'm fine." "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes, Avery, I'm doing really well." I waited for our ritual to begin. When he didn't say anything, I figured I'd just play my part. "Look, I tried to bring you a chocolate milkshake, but they wouldn't." Avery cut me off. "Oh, I got a milkshake. I'm okay now." As I began discussing the hearing, he grinned. We talked for an hour before I had to see another client. Avery never again asked me for a chocolate milkshake. We won a new trial for him and ultimately got him off death row and into a facility where he could receive mental health treatment. I never met the officer again. Someone told me he quit not long after that, last time I saw him.